Hello, guests. We'll be with you momentarily. We're going to wait a few minutes and let more people enter. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start. Hello and welcome, future problem solvers. Thank you for joining us for today's presentation, Power Up Your Story Intelligence. I'm Debbie Pruneau, the Administrative Director for FPSPI. Before we begin the presentation, I wanted to share some information in case anyone is new to Zoom. Please note the control bar at the bottom of your computer screen. For those of you using a smartphone, if the control bar is not appearing, just tap your screen and it should pop up. A few of the options on the control bar are your audio settings, chat, raise hand, and question and answer. And we're going to be recording today's presentation. Watch for a link on our Facebook page for that. And I'm going to first introduce April Mickley, our Executive Director for Future Problem Solving.
Hello, future problem solvers. Thank you for being with us today. It is my pleasure and my honor to introduce you to Richard Stone. He is outside of our future problem solving community, but he is quickly learning a lot about our great program, and I think you're going to be really inspired by the work and the information that he is sharing and doing with storytelling. I love the title, How to Power Up Your Story Intelligence. So we are pleased to have you, Rick. I know Debbie's going to share some more information about you, and welcome to your first Future Problem Solving Conference.
I'm pleased to be here with you. Thank you.
Okay, I was going to share with the audience here that Richard is a nationally recognized speaker on the power of story and its applications in business, healthcare, and education. He got his start over 25 years ago developing story-based training programs for team building and leadership development, and he's been a leader in work on narrative reminiscence. He has worked with diverse organizations such as Walt Disney Imagineering, Walter Reed Army Medical Center, Hewlett-Packard, Eastman Chemical Company, Kraft Foods, and Novant, hope I'm saying that, Novant Health.
Novant Health.
Novant, thank you. His current work at Storywork International is focused on using the power of story to assist leaders to transform their organizations and their approach to leading, infusing their work with deeper purpose and meaning. Welcome, Richard.
Well, good. Thank you both for having me, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. And I want to talk to you about an idea that maybe you've never thought about before, is that you have story intelligence. Just another couple of brief things about me is that, I've been working in and around the world of story for a while, and I've written a few books about it. I have a new book, this book, Story Intelligence on the Left, which will be coming out in the early fall. But I've developed products for organizations to use story in very applied ways. I have a board game that I've developed. I've done performances. So I've been playing with story for a while. So I thought maybe to kick things off with you is to actually tell you a story about that I think really creates a framework for understanding the relevance of story in our lives. And it's an old folk tale, but I think it'll do a pretty good job of helping us understand how important story is to both our physical well-being and our spiritual well-being. A long time ago, there was a king. He had two children. His wife had died, and they were twins, a twin girl and a boy. And these children grew up in the lap of luxury in the kingdom, in the palace. Everything they ever needed or wanted was always right there for them. They had servants waiting on them hand and foot. The meals, they would go on forever. There would be course after course of food. They did not want for anything, these two children. One day the king called them into his study and he said, "Children, I'd like you to direct the servants from now on to take all the leftovers from these sumptuous meals and put them in the cool, dark basement and store them there. Well, the children thought that was a ridiculous idea. I mean, there was so much food. Why waste time storing away food for what? But they were obedient, and they said, yes, Father, we will do that. And they directed the servants to do that, and they forgot about it. And one day, the king was getting old, and he called them in, and he said, when I die, I'd like you to take control of the kingdom, and I'd like you both to rule as equals. And who knows, someday you may need that food that you've been storing away, but they forgot about that as well. And one day the king did die when they were in their late teens, and a nearby kingdom, thinking that perhaps they were vulnerable, that they weren't quite prepared, they decided to attack them. And pretty soon the palace was surrounded on all sides. Pretty soon they were cut off from all their food. Pretty soon people were going hungry, until one of the servants came to the king and the queen, the sister and brother, and said, we have been storing all that food you told us in the basement. We could pull that back up. And they went, oh. And so they brought the food back up, and they were able to sustain themselves. And actually, they were able to come up with a ploy to sneak out in the middle of the night through a hidden tunnel, and they defeated their enemies, but only because they had that food. Well, what's the lesson here? Well, I like to think of all that food as like stories. And when we're going through our life and everyday experiences, we normally don't think much about it. But we put things back in our memory, and as time goes on, we sometimes like to recall the good times. And when we bring those memories back up and tell a story, they're nurturing. In fact, sometimes they feed us in ways that we appreciate much more in the second feeding than in the first. So stories have a precious quality, and they're very important to all of us. And in fact, there are, in indigenous cultures, often, there's an old saying that the healers would, if you came to them and you were not well, they would ask you one of four questions. When did you stop singing? When did you stop dancing? When did you stop taking time to be quiet in nature? And when did you stop taking time to listen to and tell stories? So they saw that storytelling was just absolutely integral to what it meant to be a healthy human being. So I have a little quick polling question for you, and I'd like to find out, are you a good storyteller? What's your appraisal? If you were to give yourself, an assessment and say, am I a good storyteller or not? Let's find out if you are. So, and Debbie, if you could throw the poll up, and let's tell us. So we got four answers. You don't like telling stories, you're not a bad storyteller, you're pretty good, or maybe you're really good and love telling stories. Let's see what we've got here. And how many people do we have on the conference today, Debbie? Do we know?
We have 24 attendees.
Okay, so we're getting 11, 12, and 16. We got a few more to go here. Got 4 of you who think you're really good storytellers. Some of you think you're pretty good, and some are not bad. I'm glad to see that none of you think that you don't like telling stories, so that's terrific. So hopefully you're going to learn some more today about what it means to be a good storyteller, but also how to use storytelling in a really powerful way. So we'll go ahead and end the poll if we could. And there we go. And I'll stop the sharing. Super. Okay. Can we get rid of the poll? Debbie?
Yep, I just did.
Oh, I'm still seeing it. Okay. Maybe I can, there we go. Okay.
I think you can, yep.
Okay, great. Okay. So let's go to our next slide here. So I want to introduce you to the power of storytelling, and I want to do that. I want to tell you a story, and I think then, and I'm going to ask you in the chat room to help me debrief the story to try to figure out what makes for a good story, and that's really the key piece that I want to explore with you here is what makes for a good story. So let me tell you this story, and then we'll see, listen for it, and say what was it about this story that really worked? Now, this is an old Irish folk tale. And I'll tell you the story, and here we go. And it's a story about a guy named Rory O'Donoghue. And in the wintertime, Rory in the south of Ireland, it would be pretty cold, and he would hold up in his little thatched hut, and he would make socks all winter. He would darn them, and day in and day out, he would make socks. And when spring came, he would put all those socks into a bag and throw it over his shoulder and head out from town to town, and he would sell his socks, and that's how he made a living for himself. And so one day he had a big bag of socks ready to go, and he put it over his shoulder, and he was on his way to Macroom in the south of Ireland. And he set out, and it was a miserable weather. The day was terrible. The weather was awful. And he set out into the rain and the cold, and he was walking along, and he was miserable, did not have anything to eat all day. And soon it was getting dark, and he was nowhere near Macroom. I mean, the weather was so bad. He was having to slog through puddles. And he thought, I've got to find a place to sleep for the night. And he had to find some shelter. And he's walking along, and in the distance, he saw a cabin, much like this, a light from a cabin. He thought, well, there's light. There's got to be life. And sure enough, he got to the cabin and came up on the porch, kind of brushed himself off. He was soaking wet, and he knocked on the door, and the door swung open. Now, there wasn't anyone behind that door, and he saw there sitting by the fire was an old man with a pipe in his hand. And he said, welcome, Rory, welcome you are. Come in, man. You look like you're like as wet as a wet dog. Live out there in the weather like that. Come dry off here by the fire. And Rory came in, and he stepped in, and the door came shut, but there was no one there behind the door. That was strange, but he didn't want to say anything. He was happy to be in a nice dry place, and he let his socks down on the bag, put it on the floor, and he took his jacket off and hung it on the hook, and he came and sat down by the fire, and the old man said, Rory, take off your boots and put them by the fire and let them dry out and warm up. And put your feet up there so they can get warm too. And so they sat there for a while, and the old man was just puffing on his pipe, and he said, now, Rory, would you be hungry? Rory nodded, yes. Oh, yeah, I'm starving. And he said, very well. And he clapped his hands twice, and he said, fetch a meal for Rory and myself. And just then a pot came down from the ceiling, and the door went open, and it just floated out the door and filled up with water by the stream, came in and hooked itself on a hook there in the fireplace. And the water began to boil. And then carrots and onions and all kinds of other vegetables came just sort of coming right out of the ceiling there. They were just stored up there, and they just floated in, and a knife that seemed to be held by he didn't know what, sliced them up, and into the water they went, and a large chunk of meat came floating down, and that plopped itself in the water, and after a while he had a nice frothy stew going. It was really good. And at some point the man said, I think our meal is ready. Join me at the table, Rory. And he went and sat down at the table, and that big pot of stew just unhooked itself from the fire, floated through the air, and came to rest right there on the table. And a big ladle came and dipped a big spoonful and put it into Rory's bowl there. And Rory was about to reach for his spoon when the spoon floated up, and it reached in and took a big spoonful of that stew and brought it right to his mouth. And that's the way he ate the meal that night. He didn't even have to move. It was like he was being fed like a baby. When the meal was done, they pushed away, and the old man said, join me by the fire, Rory. He went and sat down with him by the fire, and they were sitting there warming themselves, and all the dishes just rose up off the table. The door opened up. They went and cleaned themselves, and the stream outside came in and put themselves away. And now it was quiet, and the old man was puffing on his pipe, and he said, Rory, well, after a meal like that, and I have a guest here in the house, I always love to sing a song. Well, could you sing a song for me, Rory? Well, Rory kind of hemmed and hawed. He said, well, I'm not a very good singer. I'd rather not, if you don't mind. But the man was quite displeased with this. He said, well, Rory, if you can't sing me a song, maybe you could tell me a story, Rory. Certainly you can tell me a good story. And once again, Rory just kind of shook his head, and he said, I never can remember the endings of stories. I always get them wrong. If you don't mind, I'd rather not. Now the old man was not very happy at all. He said, now, Rory, If you can't sing me a song and you can't tell me a story, what good are you, man? Out with you, man. And right then, Rory didn't know what was picking him up, but something picked him up by the collar, and the door opened up, and he was thrown out onto the porch, and the door slammed shut. And he was getting up, brushing himself off when the door opened up, and his boots and his jacket and that sack of socks hit him in the face and knocked him to the ground again. Well, Rory got up, put his shoes on, put his jacket on, threw that sack of socks over his shoulder, and he headed out in the rain looking for a place to spend the night. Well, after a while, he saw a light in the distance, and he thought, where there's light, there's life. And sure enough, there was an old man sitting by a fire with a piece of meat on a spit, and he was slowly turning that meat there, cooking it by the fire. And Rory said, you mind if I join you? And the old man just nodded. And after a while, the old man excused himself, said he'd be back in a moment. Nature was calling. He's asked Rory if he would mind turning that spit so the meat didn't get burnt. Rory said, certainly. And it was late at night now, and he was tired, and Rory was turning that spit, and pretty soon he fell fast asleep. And the next thing he knew, he heard a voice. It was says, you're burning me whiskers, man, you're burning me whiskers. And Rory woke up, and it was the meat on the spit talking to him. And the meat just jumped off of the spit there, and it attacked him and had him by the neck and down on the ground. He says, look what you've done, man. You burnt me whiskers. Look what you've done. And Rory was just frightened out of his wits, and he was able to tear that meat off of his neck, and he started to run. He grabbed his socks and was running as fast as he could down the path. And the meat was attacking him from behind and nipping at his heels. And in the distance, Rory saw a light, and there was a cabin there, and he just ran up, and he didn't even bother knocking. He just opened the door, came in, and shut the door behind him. He was back in the cabin where he started out the night before. The old man was sitting there puffing his pipe. He said, Rory, you look like you've seen a ghost or something, man. And Rory said, you won't believe what happened. He proceeded to tell him the story of what had happened just a few minutes ago and how that meat had attacked him. And finally, the old man said, now, Rory, if you told a story like that before, I never would have kicked you out of the house. Well, from then on, they spent the night telling tales, and it was in the wee hours that the old man said, Rory, you tired? And he just nodded. And the man clapped his hands twice, and the covers pulled back from a little bed off in a room to the side, and Rory went in and slipped himself into bed, put his head on the pillow, and fell fast asleep. But in the morning, when he woke up, he wasn't in that cabin. He was lying out there in a field with that sack of socks under his head. And he got propped up on one elbow and looked around, and he thought, where in the world had he been the night before? So that's the story of Rory O'Donoghue. So let's debrief that story for a moment. And if you would put in the chat, if we can bring the chat up, Deborah, what do you think made that a good story? Let me get your responses for that. Let me see if I can pull the chat up as well. I'm doing that right now. So if you would enter in, why was that a story? What made it a story? Okay, it was easy to follow, says Victoria. What else? That's good. So a good story should be easy to follow. It had a sense of adventure. Yeah, that's good. The flow was engaging. Okay, had interesting twists. Okay, so stories, when they have interesting twists, they keep us involved. What were some of the components of the story? You wonder what was going to happen next. That's what we would call suspense in a story. Okay. The telling of it, okay, I was enthusiastic in the telling, and you wonder what was going to happen next. Let's see, it had a good plot, okay, so it had a beginning, middle, and end. That's what we often think of as a plot. It relates to events that happened to me in my life. Oh my gosh, Kay Doyle, whoever you are, you've ended up sleeping on a sack of socks out in the wilderness. I don't know. We had a sense of fate playing a hand in what awaited Rory, okay. It had an engaging climax. Yeah, so, you know, you didn't know what was going to happen here at the end. So not sure, not the sack of socks, but some strange places for sure. It was absorbing. What else made it a story? Anything else that you haven't seen mentioned in the chat box that made it a good story? Okay. It created mystery and suspense. Okay. Okay, good. Anything else? Let's get a couple more. Themes like light and hospitality. Great, so it had a theme to it, right? Okay, well, let me show you a slide. I mean, you guys have hit on a lot of them, and I'm going to turn the chat off here and Go to the next slide. So, you know, as far as I know, these are the things that go into a plot. Now, none of you mentioned conflict or a problem. And so we have characters. We have Rory O'Donoghue. We had the old man who was smoking his pipe in the cabin. We had the old man by the fire. There's a setting. Okay, so this was set in the south of Ireland. I told you where it was set. We talked about plot that has a kind of a structure to it. What we didn't talk, no one brought up conflict or a problem. And it turns out that every story is about someone who has a problem or a conflict. If there is no conflict, there's no problem. There's no story. There's what I would call complicating action. What that means is that things, looks like something's solved and then it gets worse. So Rory thinks he's found a place to sleep for the night and everything's going along fine, but he can't tell a story and can't sing a song, and he's thrown out in the dead of night and has to find another place. And he thinks he's found another place and everything's fine, and the next thing you know, the meat on the spit is attacking him. So that's what we would call complicating action, and then stories get resolved. There's a conclusion at the end. And someone mentioned the voice. So there's the teller, whoever's telling the story. This story, if you were telling it, you might tell it a very different way. So as far as I know, these are the basic kinds of things that you'll find in any story. Something to think about. Now, there's a distinction between between a story and an anecdote, and I want to make that for you because it's important to understand. Now, it looks like often anecdotes look like stories; they look like the same thing. So let me tell you a quick anecdote. In the mornings when I wake up, I like to have a bowl of cereal. And just this morning, I got up and I went into the refrigerator, and there was no milk. And I got to have milk on your cereal, you know. And so I got in the car and I drove down to the convenience store just around the corner and put down $2.29 and went and got a quart of milk and went home and ate my cereal. I don't know if any of you would pay $10 to go to the movie theater to see that movie, but probably not. Not very interesting. There wasn't much suspense in it or anything much else going on. It had a little teeny problem, but it wasn't much of a problem. It was really not a big deal at all. So let me tell it to you again. This morning I got up and I went in to get some milk for my cereal, and so I had no milk. And so I got in the car and I drove to the convenience store. When I walked in, there was a holdup in progress. There was a man there holding a gun, pointing it at the man behind the cash register. Well, I hate guns. And I said, "Hey, you, what are you doing there?" And he swiveled around. He was pointing the gun at me. And I hate when people point guns at me. And I walked right up to him. I said, "Put that gun away." He said, "Who do you think you are?" And I grabbed the gun. And the next thing you know, we were struggling with the gun. And pretty soon the gun started firing, and bullets were going off right into the milk case there, in the refrigerated milk case. And I saw milk pouring out on the floor. Now I was really upset. And I wrangled the gun away from the man and I knocked him out over the head. And I handed the gun, I was getting ready to hand the gun to the man behind the cash register. But the door opened and his accomplice who was driving the car, he walked in with a gun, and I shot him in the leg, and the guy dropped to the floor and he was like moaning from the gunshot in his leg. And I picked up the gun and I put both guns on the counter, and I took my $2.29, put it on the counter, and went to the milk case, and there was 1 quart of milk left that hadn't been broken up by bullets. Took the milk and went home and had my breakfast. So the first one is what I would call an anecdote. There's not much of a problem. The second one, now that's more of a story. Of course, I made that up, but it's still a story. And so one of the things that we need to distinguish between is the things of our everyday life. You know, you get home from school, how was school today? Your mom might ask, or your dad might ask, or, you're talking to your friends about things that happen. And it's more what I would call anecdotal. It's story. It's kind of things about the day, but it's not really a story. Stories are about people who have big problems, and the bigger the problem, the better the story. So it turns out that when we're listening to a story, and they've done MRI studies of people's brains when they're listening to and telling stories, it turns out that every area of the brain is lit up. It looks like a Christmas tree, with lots of lights, bright lights on it. Everything is lit up in the brain when we're listening to and telling a story. And that's why, for those of you who are teachers, and those of you who have sit in classes with teachers. When a teacher's telling a story, we tend to pay a lot of attention because it's engaging all parts of our brain. But if we're in a classroom and someone's just giving us a lecture, well, it turns out it doesn't engage all the senses the way a story does. And it just engages the areas in the brain that deal with language. And that's why when we're listening to a lecture, our mind tends to wander off. They're not as engaging, and it's hard to keep focused on it, and because story is sticky and it wants to grab us and it grabs our attention. It turns out we're wired for story. We're absolutely wired for story. And I've discovered in my work that our brain is always looking for patterns. It's always seeking out patterns. And it turns out that we have in our brain, kind of like software in a computer, we have what's called narrative schema. And our brain is looking for this, I would call it a supernormal pattern, is our brain is looking for information that looks like this. There's an introduction of setting and characters. A little story of Rory O'Donoghue. I was told you that Rory, what was the story? He lived in the south of Ireland. He made socks for a living. There is an explanation of the state of affairs. He decided to head out to sell his socks. And then there's an event that happens. And in this case, Rory has not made his way to Macroom. He's got to find a place to sleep for the night, and he's cold and he's wet. And then there's a problem. There's a problem is that he gets thrown out of the house and he has to find another place to go. And then remember we talked about complicating action? Well, then he thinks he's found another place, and then now he's got even more problems. He's got a piece of meat that he was roasting attacking him. And then there's a resolution, an outcome, and a response by the protagonist to that. Our brain is looking for this. So if you want to communicate and really get someone's attention, the more you can use story, the more powerfully you'll be able to impact them. So poll 2, I want to see how many of you ever used a story to help solve a problem. So if we could put the poll up here. There we go. We've got, so have you ever used a story? Because a lot of you are doing stuff around problem solving, right? And have you ever used a story in any way to help you with the problem? We're getting a lot of yeses. That's exciting. Some no's. Okay, but a ton of you have used a story in some way to solve a problem. That's pretty cool. That's very cool. So what I'm going to show you here in a moment is that I'm going to show you how we can use stories in all kinds of ways to solve all kinds of problems. Let me get rid of that. So I want to talk to you about what I call the 7 powers of story intelligence. And I'm going to talk about each of those. We got a few minutes left and give you some examples of each. And then and by the way, if you've got a question along the way, go ahead and post it in the Q&A box there, and Deborah will alert me. And so don't feel, stop me at any place and I'll be glad to ask your questions. So the first is the power to transport. And I'm going to go over each one of these, but I'll just give you the overview. And I'll tell you what I mean by that in a moment. This is not like getting in a car, but it's actually stories can take us to other places and other times. The power to communicate, the power to enable learning. I'll tell you a little more about that in a minute. As you see, it's not about the power to teach. I don't think actually we can teach anybody anything. I'll tell you a little bit about that in a second. The power to create meaning. Stories allow us to help understand ourselves and the world. Power to transform. And I'll give you some examples of how stories can transform. The power to bring people together, to unite people. And finally, the power to see and envision possibilities. So let's take each one in its place. So the first is the power to transport. And and I don't know, I'm sure, I'm pretty sure that some of you are from all kinds of other cultures than the United States. But you probably here in this country, if I was to start a story, I would say once upon a time. And what that is a cue to you, to your brain, that you're getting ready to go into story time. When I say once upon a time. And if I said once upon a time, a cow jumped over the moon. Now, you wouldn't at that point say, wait a second, you know, I know cows pretty well, and they can't jump, they can't hardly jump a foot or two off the ground, much less, you know, jump over the moon. And, you know, what about, there's no atmosphere up there, you know, how would they breathe, you know, would they, you wouldn't say anything. You might then go, what happened after the cow jumped over the moon? So we give our permission to the storyteller to take us someplace else, so to transport us to another world, another place and time. And in our cultures, every culture, wherever you are from, you probably have a culture, what I call the tall tale, where people tell preposterous stories about all kinds of crazy things and make up things. And maybe you like to tell tall tales. I know as a kid, I used to like to make up all kinds of stories that I thought were preposterous, and it was all for fun and all for play. And the bigger the tale, the bigger the whopper, as we would say in this country, the more fun and playful it is. And in this country, there were people like Mark Twain, who lived in the 1800s, who made up terrific stories, and Benjamin Franklin, who was one of the founding fathers of the United States, was known for his penchant to tell all kinds of stories. And he would make up stories about whales swimming up the Lawrenceville River and chasing cod who were jumping over the Niagara Falls. Well, and the incredible thing was, back in those days, because Europeans thought America was a miraculous place, he would write these stories and they would believe them, because they thought, well, you know, the United States is a whole different place. Maybe it's possible. And so we developed a tradition, especially here in this country, to really enjoy telling stories. Now, the problem is that we're all susceptible to those stories. And sometimes we think they're true when they're not true. Back in the 1930s, I think it was in the 1930s, there was a radio show, and it was kind of an entertainment show where they had music and all kinds of other things. And they announced that they would be reading a play called War of the Worlds, and it was written back by George Orwell. No, it wasn't Orwell. I'll tell you, I've just forgotten on the title. But anyway, it was written in the late 1800s. It was about Martians coming and invading the world. And they announced that they would be reading the play, and people forgot about it because then they played some music. And then the announcer would break in and said, we have an important announcement that just now we've seen explosions on the planet Mars, and it appears that projectiles are heading to the Earth. And then there would be more music, and they would say, there's reports that some kind of a spaceship has landed in Vermont in the north of the United States. And this went on through the show. And then it was announced that the Martians were attacking people in New York City with ray guns. And it was on April the 1st. It was meant to be an April Fool's Day kind of joke. But some people who tuned in and didn't hear the beginning of the announcement that this was a radio play, thought it was a true story. And they began calling the police, and then they had investigations by Congress after, about what had happened. So we're susceptible to hearing stories sometimes and believing that they're all true. So one of the things that I talk about is we have to become really smart. That's why I call it story intelligence. We have to become smart about the stories we listen to and discerning which are true and which are not true. And the world today is filled with stories. And we have social media, and you can get on your smartphone, and you could, all kinds of stories get pushed out on social media. And we have to be careful about how we ingest those. And we have to ask the question, how do we know this is a true story? And we live in a time where it's hard to tell. So it's very important to figure all that out. So the second power is the power to communicate. If you're a teacher and you're, teaching chemistry, you're having to communicate and tell information. And it turns out that we have filters. And we have filters that we use to see the world. So if you're driving down the road in a car, you have a filter, you're not paying attention much to what's going by because you're focused on the road, right? And then we have other kinds of filters that kind of allow us to sort of know what the world is going to be like. When you get out of bed and you put your feet over the bed, and you know that gravity is going to get your feet to touch the ground, and you're not going to go floating off into the sky. So we develop expectations for the way the world works. And as a result, sometimes those things are very helpful for us. So then we can develop routines and we don't have to think about them. But sometimes the filters we develop keep us from seeing new things and new possibilities. And it turns out that when we're listening to someone tell a story, they've done studies on the brain, and it turns out our brains sync up. So if one person or two people or three people are listening to the same story, their brain patterns all look the same. So if you want to get people on board with you, tell stories, tell stories. I'll tell you a quick one about how powerful stories are as a form of communication. Back about 40 years ago, there was a soap opera in Peru. And I don't know if we have anyone from South America. You may have heard of the soap opera. It was called Simplemente Maria, Simply Maria. And it was about a young teenage girl who went to work in the kitchen of an aristocratic, very rich family. And she and the son of the aristocrat fell in love, and she became pregnant. And of course, the aristocratic family, they didn't want their son to marry a peasant. And they pushed her out. This is the TV show. It's a story now. They pushed her out on the street, and she had to make her way. Someone gave her a sewing machine, and she started taking in clothes to repair the clothes using the sewing machine. And she decided she wanted to better her life. And so she decided she wanted to take literacy classes. She couldn't read and write. So she started taking literacy classes. And over the 5 years of the TV show that it ran, she began designing her own clothes. And by the last show, in the 5th year, her clothes were now being shown on the runways, the fashion runways in Paris. And she had become famous worldwide. And she decided to marry her literacy coach. And they decided to have the wedding in a church in Peru. They were going to film it. And word got out they would be filming it was a fault. I mean, it was just a show. 5,000 people showed up with presents. Now that was pretty strange. They had to rent a soccer stadium so people could file by and give their presents to her. Well, something interesting happened because of that TV show. 30,000 women in Peru bought sewing machines and started their own businesses. And at least that number of women also signed up for literacy classes. This was a pretty remarkable thing. And so there was a producer in Mexico City. His last name is Sevito. And he saw this and he thought, what happened here? How did a TV show somehow impact people's behavior in such a profound way? And so he took the show and he began running it frame by frame and looking at how the characters were created and what was going on with the characters, the good characters and the evil characters, and what he called the transitional characters who were trying to figure out whether they wanted to be good or bad. And he developed a methodology. He called it edutainment, about using stories to influence behavior and attitudes. And I've been working for a number of years on the board with an organization in New York City called PCI Media that's been using that to make a difference in developing the developing world all over the country and all over the world, and countries all over the world, around health and education and social justice and the environment. So that's a great example of using stories to communicate. Now, I told you that I didn't believe you could teach anybody anything. And what we have here is not just a doggy, he's a wolf. He's a very handsome wolf. Years ago, I worked with a woman named Paula Underwood. She was Native American. She came from the Oneida tradition. And in her tradition, they didn't have a word for teach. The best translation was enabler of learning. And they would use stories. They would tell stories. And they would never tell you, we have a tradition in the Western tradition to tell fables. They were usually stories often that were meant to teach a lesson. The Oneida would never tell you what a story meant. If they get into the story, and they have one story called Who Speaks for Wolf, it's about a time when their people had outgrown the place where they lived, and they had to send scouts out to find a new place. And it turned out the place they chose was a place where a great community of wolves lives. And one of the scouts' name was Wolf's brother, and he cautioned against moving there. He says, I don't think there's going to be room for us and for them. But people didn't listen. And things didn't turn out so well because the wolves began stealing food, and they had all kinds of problems, and realized after a very difficult season they'd have to move. So at the end of the story, they would always say, what might we learn from this story? They would ask, what might we learn from this story? They wouldn't tell you what it meant. And they knew that if you were 3 years old and you heard the story, you would see it through the eyes of a 3-year-old. And then maybe if you were 10 or 11 or 12, like some of you are here on the webinar, you might see it through a different lens. If you were 18 or 19, you might see it differently. If you were 25, you might see other things in the story. So just by asking people to reflect, to think about the story, people were able to learn. So I think that in one very powerful way, stories can do that for us. Stories can also help us create meaning. And what you have here, I don't know if any of you know about Auschwitz. During World War II, it's a place where millions of Jews were taken and actually killed by the Nazis. One of the people who was in the camp who survived was a man named Viktor Frankl. He wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. And he said that when we have a sense of purpose, when we have a sense that our life matters, we can endure almost anything that's difficult. We can endure almost anything that's difficult. And I think that's really true. I think that's really true. And so stories help us to figure out who we are in relationship to the world and what our role is in the world. Here in Atlanta at Emory University, there are a couple researchers, and they started looking at families and how families tell stories. And they discovered something just by accident almost, that in families where people told lots of stories and the kids growing up knew the stories of their family, both the difficult stories about difficult times and also good times, that those kids had higher resilience and higher self-esteem. So, resilience has to do with, how much grit do you have? How much capacity do you have when you hit a tough problem, you're able to make your way through it and not give up. You're able to keep moving forward. And so he found that actually the biggest predictor of children having high resilience and self-esteem was knowing their family's stories. So why is that? It's an interesting question. Why is that? So I think that when we're growing up, we're born into a story. We don't have a story when we're born, but there's a story going on in our family, and we're born into that story. And we don't have any stories about getting through difficult times when we're very young, because things are sort of taken care of for us. But as we get older and become adults, we face problems, and we have to deal with them on our own. And we learn lessons, and often, hopefully we learn to be able to get through them. So it turns out that if we at least have the stories of how our parents face problems, at least that becomes something we can refer to when we face a problem. You go, well, mom and dad ran into a tough time and they got through it. I guess I can too. And that's what helps us get through life and actually to create a sense of meaning and purpose in our life. The next power is the power to transform. And the question here is the past set in stone? Is the past set in stone? And I'm going to tell you something that I think is true, is that the past is a story we tell ourselves about things that happen. And we can tell different stories about the same events. And some of you may not be old enough, but I'm going to tell you something. I'm going to predict something that will happen as you get older, and if you have siblings. One day you'll be sitting with them, and you'll be talking about something that happened when you were growing up. And one of your siblings will say, oh, no, that's not what happened. This is what happened. And they'll tell you a different story. And the question is, what happened? Now, there's no big video camera in the sky that can, we can go watch the video to see what happened. Is that as we're going through our life, is that we create stories that help us make sense of that. And sometimes we make a choice about a story that isn't exactly helpful to us. We may choose a story, maybe a teacher isn't very kind to us, or says something maybe that wasn't very nice about a paper we wrote or some project we worked on. Now, you could tell the story, you go, well, I guess I'm not very smart. I guess I can't do very much in life. Or you could tell the story, well, I don't agree with her. I think I can do it better. Now, those stories go in very different directions. So you might grow up having a story, I'm not a very smart person. And it's all because you made up a story about something that happened, that someone said something to you, and you didn't have any way of knowing whether it was true or not, and you accepted it on face value. So we can change the stories that we have in our life, and we have the ability to live with a different perspective. There's an old story about a remarkable horse. It's a Chinese story in which one day this beautiful stallion rides into the stable of an old man who lives in a small little farm with his son. His mom, the wife had died many years ago, and a horse was a big thing to have. That was a really important thing to have, and it was very worth a lot of money. And a neighbor came by and said, "Ah, such good fortune, such good luck that you have this horse." The old man said, "Maybe yes, maybe no." Well, a couple days later, the horse jumped over the fence and was gone. The old man came by and said, "Such bad fortune, such bad luck." The old man once again said, "Well, maybe yes, maybe no, only time will tell." A few days went by and they heard a rumbling sound, and that horse that had jumped over the fence came back, and he was followed by 30 other horses, and they rode into the paddock, and the young man went and closed the gate, and now, my gosh, they were wealthy beyond belief. And the old man came by, the friend came by and said, "Ah, such good fortune, such good luck." But once again, the old man said, "Maybe yes, maybe no, only time will tell." A few days later, the young son was trying to break one of those horses to ride it, and it was thrown, and he broke his leg. And they didn't have hospitals like we have today, and the healer came by and was able to put a splint on it, but he was never going to be able to walk very well again for the rest of his life. And the old man came by and said, "Such bad fortune, such bad luck." But the old man, the father, said, "Maybe yes, maybe no, time will tell." 2 weeks later, the army came through town, and they conscripted all the young men and took them off to fight in the wars that were happening. And none of those young men survived. So you see, we never know whether the story is a good thing or a bad thing. It's always an ongoing story. It's never finished. So I think one of the things that stories can do is that we can learn to live with that kind of, without having a conclusion about our stories, the things that happen, and expect that often good things can happen out of bad things.
Hi, Rick.
Yes.
I want to let you know we have a question.
Yes, what is it?
It is, would you rather add mystery in a story which belongs to you, or would you stay away from that?
Well, I think it depends. There's something we haven't talked about much here yet, because this is a very short period, is the audience. So the question is, who are you telling the story to, and for what reason? Are you just trying to entertain your friends? Well, I would say adding some mystery and suspense into the story makes stories more entertaining. Are you using the story to illustrate something? I think that often that can be good too. So I think generally know who your audience is. But one of the things I like to do is, if I'm developing a story, is I try it out on a friend. I might sit down and say, "Hey, can we have a cup of tea? I want to tell you about a story I'm working on," and see what they think about it before I go and take it to a bigger group and tell them the story. So it's always good to get a little feedback from someone you trust, who can go, "Oh, I love that," or, "Gosh, you sort of overdid the suspense there. You went a little too far, perhaps." I hope that's helpful. Any other questions, Deborah?
Yep, one more. It says, should all stories have mystery?
Should they all have mystery or suspense? Not necessarily. There are some stories that are told that I will say, I'm going to say that this is that if we know what's going to happen in the story, and it's sort of telegraphed at the beginning what the conclusion is going to be about, I would say it's probably not a very good story. So we want to keep our audience engaged to think about what's going to happen next. So if you mean by mystery or suspense, I would say, yeah, all stories should have a little bit of that. They shouldn't be so clear that you know what's going to happen, because then it's not much of a story and it's not very engaging. Anything else, Deborah?
No other questions right now. Thank you.
Okay. Well, we got 2 more powers to talk about. I can do that in about 3 or 4 minutes, then we'll have room for a couple more questions before we close up the day. The next is the power to unite. And maybe where you live, I can tell you in this country, we're living through some very difficult times. We're living with people who have different stories about what America should be. And there's a lot of division in this country right now. So we know that stories can actually divide us, but stories can also unite us. And sometimes it's acts of kindness that actually help to build the bridge between people. There's a wonderful book by Stephen Carter called Civility. And he tells the story of as when he was a young kid, his parents, who were African American, moved into Washington, D.C., into a neighborhood that was all white. And as they were sitting on the porch that first day, all the neighbors were walking by and people were looking at them suspiciously. And he thought to himself, I'm never going to make any friends here. I don't feel like I'm welcome. And then it was late afternoon, and a woman was walking by and she said, hi, welcome to the neighborhood. And she said, I'll be right back. And she went into her house across the street, and she came back with a plate of sandwiches and introduced herself. And that changed everything for him, and they became fast friends. So acts of kindness can bring us together. There are cases, there's a guy named Paul Costello whom have worked with in the past. He lives in Washington, D.C. And for years, he's been bringing kids who are in their college, sort of first year of college, late high school, early college, to Washington, D.C. And he first started bringing Catholics and Protestants from Northern Ireland, which there had been conflict for generations in Northern Ireland. And he said, I had to get them out of there to do the work because people were so stuck in the stories they were telling. And in 1921, there was a terrible event where hundreds of homes were burned in a conflict. 1,000 people lost their homes. Lots of people died. He said, in the pubs in Ireland, they still tell that story like it happened yesterday. So young people go into those pubs and they're just like pickling in the juice of that story. I want them to be able to embrace a new story. It's a story about the future where people can live and work together. So he would bring them to Washington, and he's most recently been working with Palestinians and Israelis doing the very same thing. So stories, if we see that we're living inside of a story and see that it makes us see the world a particular way, we can choose to create a new story, which is a story really about harmony and bringing people together. The last power is the power to envision possibilities. And we often think of stories about thinking about the past, looking in the past. There are always stories about something that happened yesterday or a year ago or whenever, maybe in 1921, decades ago. But it turns out, because our brain is wired for story, is that stories can also help us look to the future, to think to the future. So if you're planning something, if you've got a problem you're working on, why don't you get together with your team and say, let's make up the story about what it looks like if we're successful. And what it'll help you do, it'll help you think more clearly about how to succeed. And it'll help you think about who are the antagonists that we might have to deal with. Oh, well, there's so-and-so who would object to us doing this. Well, how would we overcome that? And if we can think of that as a story, when we get to the actual situation, we will be much better prepared to actually solve it. So I see that we're right at 5 till. Why don't we see any other questions, Deborah?
No other questions currently.
We'll pause for a second and see what other questions you might have. Certainly you got something I said that maybe you said, I don't know if that's true, or maybe you have some comment on it. Anything? Are there anything in the chat that we need to look at? There's lots of chats.
Right. Nope,
But,
nothing I see.
Nope, okay.
Oh, okay, we have a question.
Good, what is it?
What is the main difference between telling stories and writing stories?
Oh, that's a good question. So, it's interesting. We say in the world of storytelling that storytelling is a co-creative process between me, the teller, and you, the listener. Now, unfortunately, I can't see you, so this is a strange world to be living in Zoom. But if you were sitting across from me, or I had an audience of people and I was telling a story, your responses, your nonverbal behavior, the expressions on your face and your body posture, they help to tell me about how to tell the story. And I bet as each of you were listening to the stories I was telling it today, you were seeing it in your mind's eye. You were recreating it in your mind. So, but I will tell you, each of you were recreating it in your own unique way. Now, I didn't tell you, the old man, I didn't tell you what he was wearing. I didn't tell you what Rory O'Donoghue was wearing, but I bet you saw it in your mind's eye. You added that to the story. So in the telling and the listening and as an audience, there is a co-creative process that happens that doesn't happen in writing, obviously, because the author isn't there when the reader is reading what the author wrote. But they're very similar in many respects. You have to sometimes in writing, I think, add a little more detail than you have to do when you're telling a story in audio, I mean, orally like this. It requires a little more detail for the reader sometimes. Not a lot more, but a little more, because I think you have to give your reader enough credit to realize that the reader, they can also co-create. They're co-creating as they're reading. So very similar, but the writing requires a little more crafting, I think, of the language. Any other questions?
We have a couple more questions. Do you think that stories are essential to growing into adulthood?
Absolutely. I think that without stories, we die. So a culture that has no stories is lifeless. But I will tell you, in America, I don't know where all of you are from, in this country, we've sort of lost touch with oral storytelling. People are too busy. They're on their social media. They're doing all the things that they do every day, and people don't take as much time to sit and listen to stories. But I think that when we do, is we become better people for it. There's a term I coined a number of years ago. I called it destorification. It's kind of like deforestation. If you go and cut down all the trees in the forest and just plant nice rows of pine trees afterwards, the life in that forest doesn't come back. And if we are not telling and listening to stories, something in us is not being brought forth. Our brain evolved with storytelling. We've been telling stories for hundreds of thousands of years as human beings. It's part of who we are. And if we stop doing it, I think we stop being human. What's the other question, Deborah?
Should we focus on our scenario or story more?
So I'm not quite sure what you mean by your scenario. Do you have any sense of what they mean by that, Deborah?
Well, scenarios, the students involved in our program write scenarios that are set 20 years in the future.
Oh, okay.
20 or more.
Okay, so you're creating a setting, a scenario about what you think is going to happen with the problem you're working on, I presume. So then the question is, what's the story of how you're going to get to that 20-year point? And if you can think through that, so that's going through the whole, what's going to happen next year in 2021 and then in 2022, what's going to happen each year to allow that outcome to occur in the year 2030, for example.
Okay, one other question. When will your new book be out?
It'll be out in the fall, and hopefully maybe April when it comes out, she can let folks know if you're interested in getting it. Love to have you buy one.
Yes, we can certainly post it on Facebook and our
I've been putting,
sites.
if you have interest, I've been putting up a blog every week. On the website is called 7powersofstory.com. You can go there, 7powersofstory.com, and I've been putting a blog up every week on stories. So if you want to read more, it's actually material. I had too much material in the book and I had to cut it out of the book. So I've got enough for every week. So go sign up and I'll see that you get the blog every week.
Excellent. Okay, I don't see any more questions. I think we are just about at 4 o'clock.
4 o'clock. Well, good. Thank you all for being such a good audience, and thanks for having me.
I spoke too soon. I'm sorry. One more question.
Okay.
How could we collect more stories to tell?
Well, that you have to become like a reporter. First I'd start with your family. Sit down with your mom and dad and say, tell me about what it was like when you were growing up. Where did you go to school? Who are your best friends? Find out everything you can about your family. What kind of tough times have we gotten through, that you've gotten through? What things have you learned in life? So start with your family and then work your way up to talking to other adults to tell you stories. So become inquisitive and curious.
Excellent. Excellent. Okay, no other questions now.
Okay, I think we've hit our timeline.
Yep. Thank you very much.
Hey,
And
thank you all.
thank you, Mr. Stone, for joining us, for sharing your expertise. This was an enjoyable session, and we all have lots to learn from each other. So thank you for being with us.
Thanks a lot, April.